All right, so from the reference guide to regulatory compliance within subsection 3, deposits, electronic fund transfers act, I had started on page 458 and discussed the issuance of access devices, payroll card accounts, and actually overdraft and remittance transfers. Was getting into the disclosures required under remittance transfers and the format of those disclosures, specifically on page 463. That's grouping. The transfer amount, transfer taxes, transfer fee, and total must be grouped together. In the last recording that I lost, there was a definition of transfer amount, transfer taxes, transfer fees, and total. To the transfer amount, transfer taxes, transfer fees, and the total to the recipient denominated in the currency that they will be received by the recipient must be grouped together as well. In terms of proximity, the exchange rate must be in close proximity to the transfer amount, transfer taxes, transfer fees, and total. 2, the notice of the right to error resolution and the right to cancellation must be in close proximity to the date available. And the recipient, the provider contact information, and the information on the state agency that regulates the transfer and the CFPB website information. Lastly, disclosures provided via mobile applications and text messages do not have to meet the proximity requirements. Prominent size and segregation. Disclosures must be on the front of the page, segregated from other information, and in 8-point type except for mobile applications and text messages. Estimated disclosures must be marked estimated. The language of disclosures must be in English, and each language that the provider uses to advertise, solicit, and market remittance transfers either orally, electronically, or in writing at the office where the sender conducts the transaction or asserts the error, the foreign language used by the sender with the remittance transfer provider to send the transfer. Disclosure in mobile applications and text messages must be in the language used by the sender with the provider to send the transfer. For estimates, there is a temporary exception which insured depository institutions may provide estimates on prepaid disclosures, receipts, combined disclosures, and pre-authorized payment disclosures as long as the provider cannot determine the amounts for reasons beyond its control and the transfer comes from the sender's account at the institution. This exception already expired on July 21st of 2015. The permanent exception for transfers to certain countries as published on the list by the CFPB. The exception allows estimates instead of exact information to continue if the provider cannot determine the amount because 1, the laws of the recipient country do not permit a determination, and 2, the methods by which the transactions are made in the recipient country do not permit a determination. The basis for estimates, 1, is the exchange rule. A, estimates for ACH transactions must be based on the most recent exchange rate for that country published by the Federal Reserve. B, the most recent published wholesale exchange rate plus any additional spread typically added by a correspondent. Or C, the most recent exchange rate offered by the person making the funds available to the recipient. 2, the transfer amount and the currency in which the funds will be received. The exchange rate must be estimated on the above rules, which were the exchange rate rules. For other fees, for fees that are a percentage of the amount transferred, the exchange rate must be calculated as described above, again in the exchange rate section, basis for estimates. Estimates for taxes imposed by an intermediary financial institution must be based on either 1, the last transfer the provider made to the recipient's institution, or 2, a representative route identified by the provider. Other taxes imposed by a recipient country must be estimated by using the exchange rate rules described above, and the fee itself must be based on either 1, the last transfer the provider made to the recipient's institution, or 2, a representative route identified by the provider. And lastly, the amount of currency to be received by the recipient. This amount must be estimated by using the rules for estimating exchange rate and other fees as described above. Resolving errors of remittance transfers. An error is an incorrect amount paid by a sender, a bookkeeping error made by the provider. 3, the failure to make the disclosed amount available to the recipient unless the amount was an estimate and the difference is due to taxes unless the amount was due to taxes or fees, or the failure resulted from extraordinary circumstances beyond the provider's control. Fourth, the failure to make funds available to the recipient by the date disclosed unless the failure is due to 1, extraordinary circumstances beyond the sender's control, or 2, the delay was due to the provider's VA mail program. 3, the remittance transfer was made with fraudulent attempt. And fifth, the sender's request for, this is resolving errors, the sender's request for documentation and for additional information to determine if an error was made. B, an error does not include an inquiry about the status of a remittance transfer except when the funds were not provided to the recipient by the date disclosed. B, a request for information for tax or record-keeping purposes. C, a change requested by the recipient, or D, a difference in the amount or type of currency. Notice of error. Are we still recording? Good Lord. A notice of error is timely if it is received by the provider no later than 180 days after the disclosed date of the availability of funds. If the error is based on documentation sent by the provider, the notice is timely if sent by the later of 180 days after the date of the availability or 60 days after the documentation is sent. The notice must enable the provider to identify the sender's name and address or telephone number, the recipient's name, and, if known, the address or telephone number, and last, the remittance transfer to which the notice of error applies. The notice must indicate why the sender believes that an error exists and includes, to the extent possible, the date, the type, date, and amount of error. Investigation. A provider must promptly investigate and determine if an error occurred within 90 days of receiving a notice of error. A provider must notify the sender within 3 days of completing an investigation. Remedies. If an error has occurred, the provider must correct it within 1 business day after receiving the sender's instruction regarding the appropriate remedy. In the case of payment of the incorrect amount, the computational or bookkeeping error, or a failure to pay to the correct recipient, the sender must either refund the amount paid to the sender or make available the correct amount to the recipient without additional cost to the sender, and refunding any fees charged unless the sender provided incorrect information. 3, in the case of a request for additional documentation, information, or clarification, the provision of such documentation, information, or clarification. 4th, this is in the remedies section. If a provider determines that no error occurred or a different one occurred, the provider must send a written explanation to the sender along with a notice of the sender's right to receive the documents upon which the provider relied in making its determination. 5th, upon request, the provider must promptly provide copies of the documentation upon which it relied in making its decision. The 6th remedy, a provider has no responsibility if the sender reasserts the same error unless it is asserted after receipt of the information supplied in the error resolution process. And the 7th point under remedies is, if applicable, the other error resolution requirements of Reg E and the error resolution requirements of Reg Z will continue to apply to the transaction. Compliance program, F, under remittance transfers. A provider must develop written policies and procedures designed to ensure compliance with the error resolution provisions of Reg E. Such policies and procedures must include record retention provisions for documentation related to resolving errors. Which I'm just going to skip to that section right now. The bank must keep records of compliance for not less than 2 years from the date the disclosures were provided, and if under investigation by a regulatory agency or if a suit is filed, must keep records until final disposition of the investigation or the suit. Back to cancellation and refund of remittance transfers. The responsibility to cancel a transaction is limited to 30 minutes after the sender makes the payment if the request to cancel contains enough information for the provider to identify the sender's name and address or telephone number and the transaction to be canceled, and the transferred funds have not been picked up by the recipient or deposited into an account of the recipient already. This can be done in oral or written request. Upon cancellation, the provider must refund to the sender the entire amount of a remittance transfer, including all fees and taxes, within 3 days of receiving the notice of cancellation. When transactions that are scheduled at least 3 days in advance, the provider must cancel them if notice is provided at least 3 days in advance and contains information to identify the sender's name and address or telephone number and identifies the transactions. Agents. A provider is responsible for any violations of this regulation by its agent when the agent acts on the provider's behalf. And transfers scheduled in advance. For transfers scheduled in advance, the provider must provide the required prepayment disclosure prior to the transaction and the receipt at the time of the first scheduled transfer. For subsequent transfers, provide a prepayment disclosure prior to the transfer and a receipt within 1 business day of the transfer. If the transfer is debited from the sender's account, the receipt information must be provided on the periodic statement. Up to the enforcement section of Reg E. For some reason, it's shown here as Title 15 of the United States Code, Chapter 1693M. But within civil liability, there can be actual damages, costs, and attorney fees, and defenses being the acts of God or other circumstances beyond the control of the institution, technical malfunctions known to the consumer at the time of the EFT, or bona fide errors. Under FERA penalties, the penalties can be up to $7,500 per day for violation of laws and regulations, or $37,500 per day if violations or unsafe or unsound practices are engaged in recklessly or are part of a pattern of misconduct that causes more than a minimal loss to the bank or any pecuniary gain to the parties involved. There are penalties up to $1,375,000 per day against persons who knowingly commit a violation and knowingly or recklessly cause a substantial loss to the bank or a substantial benefit to the party. Criminal liabilities are fines up to $5,000 and/or imprisonment up to 1 year for knowingly giving false information or disclosures. The fines can be up to $10,000 and/or 10 years of imprisonment for more serious offenses, including forging, counterfeiting, or stealing debit devices to obtain goods, monies, or services. Now that I've finished the Electronic Funds Availability Act, I'm going to go back to the section that I actually lost in recording for the next couple of minutes to try to discuss the parts that had been cut off. This is the issuance of access devices, which is relatively normal. You can issue devices as long as they're not validated yet, and you want to give a disclosure with a clear explanation that the device is not validated and how the consumer may either dispose of it or validate it, and that in order to do so, the company must verify the consumer's identity. There is also a section on stop payment that is still unchanged. You want 3 days oral or in writing notice, and the institution only has to stop the transaction for 14 days if oral notice is given and not followed up with written confirmation. The rules for payroll card accounts are under Title 12 of the Code of Federal Regulations in the CFPB Chapter 1005.18. These payroll card accounts are issued by employers for wages, salaries, or other compensation on a recurring basis, and you don't necessarily have to provide a periodic statement if there's a telephone line, and you have to retain electronic history of the account for 60 days preceding the time the consumer electronically accesses the account, and make that available upon request. But you also have to explain to the consumer how to request their history. And for error resolution purposes, correct errors that are reported within 60 days of the earlier of the EFT or the date the institution sends a written history of the account upon which the transaction appears. Under overdraft services, fairly simple that someone has to opt in before they can be charged an ATM or debit card transaction that overdraws the account. This is regardless whether there were other transactions that made funds that were seemingly available at the time. and yet the account was still overdrawn. And there's also conditioning rules